Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Разрешите мне на правах хозяина поприветствовать всех присутствующих с началом новой серии лекций в фонде «Стратегия 2020». Мне, как представителю МГИМО, хотелось бы пожелать успехов работы лекционного клуба. И нам очень приятно, что сегодня здесь собралась такая представительная публика. Мы надеемся, что наши сегодняшние дебаты будут интересными и взаимообогащающими. Мы очень рады, что МГИМО становится площадкой для различных дискуссий, различного плана. И это, безусловно, обогащает и наших преподавателей, студентов, и тех, кто приходит к нам на круглые столы. Я с удовольствием передаю слово президенту фонда «Стратегия 2020» Михаилу Ремезову для ведения сегодняшнего мероприятия. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Я думаю, что я скажу несколько вводных слов с коллегами по поводу в целом той серии дискуссий, которую мы наметили, и потом, уже после выступления нашего сегодняшнего лектора, передам бразды правления модератору нашей сегодняшней дискуссии Владиславу Леонидовичу Иноземцеву. Пока немного о серии лекций, о концепции, которую мы в нее закладывали. Сегодня вышло приложение «Независимое», у вас в папках есть, вы можете посмотреть, там есть интервью с несколькими лекторами, которые у нас выступят, там есть какие-то размышления о тематике, которую мы хотели бы сделать предметом обсуждения. Понятно из всего сказанного, что мы хотим вести разговор о российской модернизации в контексте какой-то глобальной ситуации. Вот какая-то глобальная ситуация, мне кажется, очень удачным оказался тезис Зигмунда Баумана на последней странице, который в своем интервью вспоминает Антонио Грамши, который писал: «Кризис заключается в том факте, что старое умирает, а новое не может зародиться. В этом междуцарстве появляется множество патологических синдромов». Вот глобальная ситуация, как мне кажется, действительно может быть описана этим словом, междуцарствие, этой ситуации, когда старые уходят, а новые еще не формируются. Что старые уходят? Ну, очевидно, кризис финансового глобального капитализма, который о себе заявил, и не только, в общем-то, в 2008 году, но и раньше, еще в начале нулевых. Об этом все говорят, но альтернатив по-прежнему нету. И мы видим это и на российском примере, когда в выступлении министра финансов нашего признается российская экономическая модель докризисная, неэффективной, дисфункциональной, но никаких альтернатив этой экономической модели не предлагается, и больше того, в каком-то смысле они даже блокируются. Мы видим аналогичную ситуацию безальтернативности старому умирающему порядку и в геостратегии, потому что есть некий кризис американской гегемонии, американского доминирования в мире, но совершенно нет желающих разделить эту глобальную ответственность, как мне представляется. Нету тех титанов, атлантов, которые готовы взять небо на плечи вместо Соединенных Штатов. Мы видим то же самое и в более глобальном разрезе, и об этом тоже говорит господин Бауман и господин Грей вот в этих интервью. Это кризис модернити. Но альтернативной социальной парадигмы как не было, так и нет. Все, что мы можем сказать о мире без модернити, это описывается приставками «пост». Альтернативная геокультура, как выразился Валерстайн, не воззревает. И вот эта вот ситуация безальтернативности при уходящих, несущих конструкциях старого мира, это очевидный вызов, в том числе интеллектуальный вызов. Здесь есть то пространство, которое мы должны восполнить обменом стратегий. Обменом стратегий внутри российского экспертного сообщества и между российским экспертным сообществом и интеллектуальными лидерами, прежде всего, западного мира. Я попрошу руководителя международных проектов фонда Никиту Куркина сказать несколько слов о других лекторах, о нашем сегодняшнем лекторе, прежде чем передать ему слово. Можете рассматривать это в качестве своего рода анонса и также в качестве попытки обозначить контекст, в котором происходит и сегодняшняя дискуссия.
Да, я буду краток. чтобы не отвлекать нас от основного участника нашего мероприятия. И скажу следующее. Как вы видите в названии нашего фонда, есть слово «стратегия». Эта стратегия не может существовать в безвоздушном пространстве, не может существовать в вакууме. Она находится в соприкосновении с другими стратегиями, российскими стратегиями, мировыми стратегиями, стратегиями западными, стратегиями восточными. И мы должны находиться в контексте постоянного осмысления этой ситуации. Поэтому среди участников нашего лекционного клуба мы видим господина Люттвака, одного из самых, на мой взгляд, интересных американских мыслителей современности. Вот, автора множества книг, которые ввели в политический язык совершенно новые терминологии. Это геоэкономика, господин Люттвак изобретатель геоэкономики. Это турбокапитализм, этот термин также придумал господин Люттвак. И также господин Люттвак известен как военный историк, что позволяет ему компетентно говорить о стратегиях вообще. Также, переходя к другим участникам лекционного клуба, я должен сказать, что следующим нашим гостем предполагается господин Франко Бассанини. Это глава клуба долгосрочных инвестиций Западной Европы. Человек, который руководит проектом создания долгосрочных инвестиций и видит Россию как одно из средств приложения своего интереса, в том числе и финансового. Это Зигмунд Бауман, живой классик социологии, мнение которого бесконечно интересно. И завершит весенний сезон Джон Грей, выдающийся британский философ, автор очень интересных книг, в том числе переведенные на русский язык книги «Поминки по просвещению». Все, я передаю слово господину Люттваку и предлагаю ему начать его выступление.
Good day. Thank you for this invitation. First of all, I should say that strategy, the word strategy, is now, of course, used by everybody to say everything. It used to mean like a plan, like an intention, like a tactic, anything. But actually, such a thing as strategy exists, and it is what happens when you have conflict. When you have conflict, you cannot act in a linear way. So those of you who have ever been interested in strategy and have read Clausewitz, for example, Clausewitz was a good German philosopher. He wrote in a complicated way, but what he's really writing about is the dialectical situation. So if you are not in the world of strategy and you want to go from A to B, you ask yourself, what is the shortest road? What's the best road and the shortest road? And you go from A to B. The moment you're in conflict, you know the enemy is waiting for you, so you don't want to go from A to B. So you say, not what is the shortest, straightest road, but how can I get there over the mountains or around the forest? So this is, therefore, the logic of strategy is always a paradoxical logic, always a contradictory logic. And in a static way, you begin by saying that the good road is bad. Why? Because it's a good road and it's a straight road, that's why they're waiting for you. The bad road, the narrow one, the one through the woods or the mountain, the bad road is good. So you begin with this contradiction, paradox, in a simple, static way, and then you proceed to dynamic contradiction. The army that advances and advances and advances, where is it going to? It's not going to victory, it's going to defeat. Because if you just keep advancing, you will be going away from your base, and you are running into more and more problems, and the enemy is going into his home base, and he's got all his reserves there, so that victory becomes defeat. Now it's dynamic. And if you're defeated and you're withdrawing, as you withdraw, the enemy becomes tired, less willing to fight, and then you get stronger, so defeat becomes victory. So it goes like this. I wrote a whole book about this, which is called Strategy, the Logic of War and Peace. And the Russian publisher, who's actually sitting here, Andrei, who's already just published my Byzantine book, will publish this other book. This book has been translated in different languages, like German and French and so on, and it never does me any harm, except in China. I like China very much. I go to Beijing all the time. Whenever I meet a Chinese general, he wants to take his gun and shoot me, because when they become senior colonel, what they call senior colonel, in the Chinese army, they have to go to a special school, and in this school, they give them my book. And my book is very hard. I don't know how they translate it in Chinese, but in English it's hard. The other books I wrote are not hard. This book is just badly written book, because I'm not a German philosopher. So when you write about German philosophy and you're not a German philosopher, it's a little awkward and crude and so on. But never mind. So every Chinese general has to read the book, and so they invite me all the time to China, but they hate me because they have to pass the exam on a book, which in Chinese must be even harder. All of this stuff, fortunately, is not our business today. Today, we're dealing with very simple things. First, because whoever is doing national policy for Russia has a very simple job. And as this is an industrial, semi-industrial, semi-post-industrial society. And the Russians are very proud that Russia is different. And everybody thinks Russia is different, but in this, Russia is like everybody else. Actually, like every other country except the United States. You're the same as France and Italy and Spain and Germany, identical. Why? Because national policy today means only one thing. How do you persuade women in your country to have babies? Because if women don't have 2.2 babies or more than 2.2 babies, you have no future. And if you have no future, you don't have any problems. You don't have to worry about the future of Russian science or future of Russian education or Russian industry. Like you're Spanish, for example. In Spain, in the last few years, they've had some real breakthrough social achievements. Gramsci, who was just mentioned, who was actually an Italian of Albanian origin, who ended up in Sardinia and spent most of his life in prison. He was extremely, of course, today is very fashionable and so on. And Gramsci socialism is the dominant philosophy, actually, of the Spanish Socialist Party, which was not a Marxian party. And they have done a lot of wonderful things. Like, for example, they have legalized homosexual marriage, which is very important. Freedom of abortion. Anybody can have an abortion in Spain. That's very important. They've done a lot of important things. They've got high-speed trains, and they have a huge, or they had, now they stopped, huge program of wind power and so on. The only thing they don't have is babies. There are no babies in Spain. And if you look at the Spanish demography, you can see the long-term planning in Spain is very simple. You don't have to do anything, because there will be no Spain. In the south, there is more and more Moroccan population, Moroccans there. You see already signs written in Arabic and so on. And so they took them 500 years to push the Arabs out of Spain, fighting the war. And now they are coming back without even fighting a war. So what is the problem? Is that to get women to make babies, you need a special technology. You have to have a system where the woman is getting prenatal care, pregnancy care, with a diploma. And the diploma she has to have is only to be female and pregnant. She doesn't need documentation. She doesn't need a PhD, a master's, a passport, a registration. And the people, But to do this, you have to have prenatal care, birth care, you have to, some organization, private or public, has to give her 1 year of income after birth, decent income. Then if she has housing problem, this has to be dealt with. So a few countries have made this technology, they have this organization, and the countries, the big example would be France. They have developed the whole technique, and the result is that they have babies. And this would be, if I was the Tsar of Russia, I would get up every morning and I would measure my performance by saying how many babies were born yesterday. Now, remember, the numbers are very cruel. It used to be 1.5. It increased in Russia to 1.8. And that is because of the extraordinary contribution of a few people. Dagestan, in Ingushetia, and so on, a lot of babies. So that is how you get to 1.8. But 1.8 is useless. If you have 1.8, you might as well have 1.4. Actually, even 2 is not enough. You have to have 2.2, just not to disappear. So if you think in those terms, you get yourself a social policy, a welfare policy, and this enables you to structure of it. But I only know of 2 countries where they have a baby-centered policy. One is France, where they really have a whole system. And it requires all kinds of tricky things. Like, for example, you cannot have big organizations like mother-child clinic that you have to drive an hour. You have to have little ones everywhere. So if you don't like them or they don't like you or you quarrel with the lady, you go to another one. So this has to be subtle. The other very interesting one is the one in Israel, which is called a drop of milk. It's called a drop of milk. And it's interesting because they built that system when they were a very poor country. Today, they are not a poor country, high income, high growth. They have lots of money, but they built it when they had no money, so it's kind of interesting methodology. But to me, it's very interesting that you can go to 50 policy conferences in a country like Italy or Spain, and you hear people talking about 50 things. And they don't talk about the only thing that is really the national problem, which they have. Now, we don't have that problem in America because, as you all know, America is God's own country. Actually, it's the country that God made. All the other countries were made by people. We were made by God. And one of the things that God arranged for us is that since we are an industrial country and we have South below us, the same as Europe and Russia, in our case, the whole population of the South are Christians, and coming from countries like Bolivia or Mexico or Colombia and so on, when they come to the United States, they join in the military service, but they don't go to the army. They go to the Morskoye Pihotka. Why? It pays the same as the army, the pay is the same, but they fight more. So a Mexican, Manuel Martinez, from Mexico, arrives, him or his son go into the Marine Pihotka, into the Marines, they call it. Then he puts the tattoo of the Marines on his arm, and he is not becoming an American, he's becoming a super American. And therefore, we don't need to make our own babies. We can import our babies. If the Europeans import their babies, they're getting Africans and Arabs. You're getting people from the Caucasus, wonderful people and all that, but there are some different things. So that is, let's say, national policy has become easy. The epistemological question, the intellectual question, the analytical question, the Gramsci question is, how come all these so-called national conferences that they have, whether you go to Davos Forum, or you go to this forum, or the Bilderberg, or in Italy they have the Ambrosetti, and in France they have, a million conferences, they never talk about this. even as the whole thing is collapsing and falling into the hole. So that's the intellectual question of how come the intellectual functioning of the system is such that nobody talks about the big issue. Now, the other thing for Russia is extraordinarily fortunate. This time, you're very lucky. You can say Russian history was not always lucky. For geographic reasons, of course, being near the steppe means that instead of having Renaissance, you have Zolotaya Orda, you know. But this time, Russia is super lucky. In the year 2010, Russia finds itself in a unprecedented, first time in Russian history situation. And that is that if you go back and just look at the last 1,000 years or so, Russia was either ignored by the West usually, or threatened by the East, or sometimes lately threatened from the West, the Poles, the Polish attacks, and then German and so on. Either threatened or ignored. Russia itself did some threatening, but in a few occasions, relatively few occasions. The Cossacks once were having their horses in the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris, but mostly threatened and ignored. Now, for the first time, everything is changing because a diplomatic revolution is taking place. The diplomatic revolution is so new, and it just started that people don't talk about it. There isn't this phrase called diplomatic revolution, but they will talk about it. And this diplomatic revolution is caused by the rise of China. Now, as you know, the rise of China was not supposed to create a diplomatic revolution because the Chinese are very nice, intelligent people. So they sat around the table and they said, we must not have the rise of China. We must have the peaceful rise of China. And Zhen Bijian, who is my very good friend in Beijing, and he's the chief advisor of Hu Jintao, and he is the one who made the first speech about it. Then he wrote a famous article, also in Foreign Affairs, published and so on, The Peaceful Rise of China, which is how you can grow and become a very rich country with huge economic impact, but not provoke reactions against you. Because when you rise, people react, of course. And when they react enough, they block you. So how you prevent that? Peaceful rise. China will develop, right? China will become rich, but China will not threaten anybody, and so on. So what have these Chinese done since 2008? When the economic crisis happened, and they saw the downfall of the US economy, the downfall of the Western economy, they said the Beijing consensus, the Chinese way, state capitalism, state-owned companies, party control, this is the way to be successful. So this was normal, understandable. You see somebody slipping, you're doing well, and you suddenly think that everything he does is wrong, everything you do is right. That's a normal thing. They did it too. Unfortunately, they did something else. They destroyed the whole strategy of peaceful rise by suddenly starting to quarrel with India, reviving a forgotten territorial dispute over what the Indians called Arunachal Pradesh, which the Chinese call South Tibet. This subject, nobody talked about it. In 1962, they fought a war there. And then in 1987, the Indians formed the state. The Chinese made a formal protest, just formal protest, 3 words on a piece of paper. Now, suddenly, in 2009, they start talking about it and raising it all the time, demanding and so on. Then they did other things. they suddenly de-recognized Indian control of Kashmir. So if you are an Indian and your passport says you're born in Kashmir, you go to the consulate to get a Chinese visa, and they will not print the visa on your passport. They put it on a piece of paper to de-recognize Kashmir. Now the Indians suddenly feel threatened by China. This is no more peaceful rise. So they made some steps. This is just the beginning. A diplomatic revolution takes time for people to understand it, takes time to implement. But for example, just in the last year, the Indians did two things. One, they told us, thank you for all the offers of advanced fighter aircraft, combat aircraft, but we are going to develop the next one with Sukhoi. And they gave a check of $2 billion, $2,000 million to Mr. Pogosyan up there in Komsomolsk-on-Amur to make the next Sukhoi fighter, so it will not be sold to China, because it will be co-development. Second thing the Indians did, they stopped buying certain important things from China, like telecommunications equipment. The biggest telecom company in China is called Huawei. They sell all this telephone machinery. Switch gear is called, and interchange gear. And the biggest market they had was India. Last year, suddenly the Indians stopped buying it. They forbade any telecom company to import the equipment. This is very small reactions. This is no more peaceful rise, but it's only India. Second example will be Vietnam. The Chinese in Vietnam have had the territorial problem of the Spratly Islands for a long time, but nothing was happening. Suddenly, they start sending ships there and pushing it on. Then the Chinese foreign minister visits Singapore and opens the presentation by saying, we are a big country, and you, Singapore, are a small country. Now, I don't believe that the Singaporeans needed to be told that Singapore is smaller than China. They probably knew that Singapore is smaller than China. But the foreign minister of China felt it important to tell them that. This is not peaceful rise. Finally, Japan. Japan is the most dramatic example because, as you all know, 6 months ago or so, Mr. Ozawa, the only senior politician in Japan who has always been anti-American, his party wins finally instead of the other party. He goes to Beijing with a delegation of 500 businessmen and basically goes to Beijing to tell the Chinese, we finished with the Americans. The American model is wrong. The Chinese model is right. We're going to finish with the Americans. We're going to be there. So what did the Chinese do? Instead of giving the hand and accepting the visit, the homage of this guy, they are instead kicking the Japanese and sending ships to do it. So what the Chinese are doing is actually seems impossible. How can intelligent people behave so stupidly? How can very sophisticated people who 10, 15 years ago developed the theory of peaceful rise because they know what happens, how can they make such a mistake? How they can be so naive? And I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this, but the easy way to understand this, if you without thinking too much, is just to remember that in 1890, the German case. You arrive in Berlin in 1890. In Berlin, you have the world's best universities. They were leading in philosophy, they were leading in literal studies, they were leading in classical studies, they're leading in chemistry, in everything. You have the best industry, the most advanced industry, chemical, pharmaceutical, Bayer, aspirin, Siemens, and so on. And they already have very powerful banks, and they are the intellectual leaders of music, of philosophy, of culture, of industry, of money, and everything. And you say to themselves, if this is how Berlin is in 1890, with electrical light and so on, how will they be in 30 years' time? Go to Beijing and Shanghai now, and say to yourself, how will it be in 30 years' time? Well, if you were there in 1890, this brings you to 1920. In 1920, Germany is defeated. Germany is divided. They lose territory in the east, Poland and some. Inflation and social destruction, and they have another 25 years of disaster and Hitler and war and so on. How in 1890 they did not become? How was that possible? Well, what they did not realize was that Germany could have the best universities and the best industry and the best banks, but they could not have a navy. If you also build a navy, if you build warships, you will not be able to survive. Why? Because the British, they were willing to have Germany have the best universities and the biggest banks. They were willing to accept intellectual leadership. I mentioned that when you go to Oxford, went to Oxford already in 1900. You needed to know German to study Greek, German to study Latin, German to study chemistry and physics. So what can you do just with English? Answer, English literature. You could not study anything in Oxford without knowing German. So you can, all of this the British were willing to give to the Germans. The one thing they were not going to give them was to allow them to have a navy. That's all. So because they built a navy, the British solved all the many big problems with the French, colonial fights they had in Africa and Asia. They made entente with France, and then in 1907, in spite of the hatred of the Tsar, of Rasputin, and of this and that, and pogromists and reactionaries and anti-socialists and shooting workers and all that, they went in 1907 and made the treaty with Russia. So at that point, in 1907, Germany is surrounded by the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Russian Empire. What does it mean? It means that the German army could win 100 battles, win every battle, and still they be surrounded. Still they would not be able to import raw materials and what they needed, and slowly they would starve and lose. So they could only win battles, never win a war. Now, how come the most educated people, the most advanced people in the world could make such a stupid mistake to build a navy? And you ask them, well, the reason is that this is not an intellectual issue at all. And I spent the whole month of October in Beijing talking to the generals, the admirals, the Air Force guys, the advisor, this guy, Zhen Bijan, the Mr. Dai Bingwo, who is foreign affairs coordinator for the foreign ministry and the party external affairs department. I asked them the same question. I said, you are supposed to be intelligent people. What about Shunze and Shunzi and Sumpi and so on? How could you be so stupid as to build a navy? I did not think about Russia at that time. It's only been developing these ideas since being in Moscow in the last few days. But actually, in 1907, the Germans could have saved themselves in 1907. And they could have reached 1920 as the richest and most advanced country in the world. To this day, today, they would be the most advanced and richest country in the world, and they would have Silesia, and they would probably have Austria and everything. What was the answer? You go to see the Kaiser Wilhelm and the Chancellor of Germany and the head of the army, you put them in a room and say, now listen, today the British held their noses and signed a treaty with the Russian Empire. So you must answer. Otherwise, Germany is finished. Finished. And what is the answer? Sell the ships of the German Navy to Argentina, to Brazil, to Russia, to Turkey. Just sell the ships. The moment you sell the ships, the British are not interested anymore to be anti-German. They will start quarreling with the French again. They will be quarreling with the Tsar because the Tsar is shooting the workers and the socialists are in the parliament and so on. Sell the ships. Now, you go to the most intelligent people in the world and you tell them such a simple thing that you can solve all your problems by selling your ships, and they would not be able to understand you, not because you're intelligent or stupid, but because emotions are dominated. And the rule of strategy is a very simple rule. Whenever you feel good, the situation is bad. When you feel enthusiastic, it's terrible. And that is the problem in China today. Because Mr. Zhang Bijan knows exactly what is happening and what will happen. Mr. Dai Bingguo knows exactly what's happening. When I told them, I sent an email to Zhang Bijan saying, Berlin 1890, 30-year projection. And he said, I know, don't think I don't know. I'm in Beijing. But the problem is, they cannot control it because of hubris. Hubris. I don't know how you say hubris. Hubris is not an English word, it's a Greek word. We use it in English. It is when the gods want to destroy you, first they make you mad. And they make you mad by clouding your vision because of enthusiasm and being prisoner of your success. And that's when you make the mistake of strategy. Because in other subjects in life, you can make many little mistakes, and medium mistakes, and big mistakes. In strategy, there's only one mistake, and it's called not stopping. When you have reached the culminating point of success. You know, you're Napoleon, you've conquered Poland, you have to stop. People said to you, oh, Russia is so easy, the Russian army is so weak, our artillery is better and so on. You have to say, no. The Chinese, intellectually, Dai Bingguo, who is really the coordinator of policy, knows it. The chief advisor knows it. Hu Jintao knows it, but they cannot control the army, the navy, the air force, the foreign ministry, and so on. Foreign ministry is the only foreign ministry in the world which tries to be more nationalistic than the mainstream population. They're the ones who, after the Japanese gave back the fishing boat captain, this official, vice foreign minister, a lady of already 60 years, but really beautiful woman. And she got up there and said, now we want an apology and compensation. So the Chinese fishing boat captain tried to hit the patrol boats because the Japanese patrol boats are small and light with thin hulls. And he has a heavy iron hull, tried to sink it. It's all on YouTube. She's demanded apology and compensation. Why is that? Because in the internet world, they are always attacking the foreign ministry for being soft. So that's their attitude. The same as the Air Force showing off the new fighter aircraft, which is not even a prototype, and so on. So the result of this is that an anti-China coalition is naturally emerging between Japan, Vietnam, and India. And you can laugh at this coalition because the Japanese are very strange people, Vietnam is a very small country, and the Indians are a little bit chaotic and anarchical and disorganized. But if you look just at numbers, they have more people than China, they have more money than China, and more technology than China. And that's without us, because this is not, anti-China is not America, because we are half and half. We like many China things. We are half and half. We are not the protagonist. This is not going to be Beijing versus Washington. This is us being in a second role, like America in 1940. Not America during the Cold War, Washington, Moscow, but America in 1940. There is Paris, there is London, and there is America behind. And what happens next, and I will end with this, what happens next is that today we are in the nuclear era, we are in the post-nuclear era, This is not 1914. This doesn't lead to any wars. There's going to be no wars. It's all going to be done economically. This is geoeconomics. It's the logic of strategy, but in the grammar of geoeconomics, not in the grammar of war. So Huawei, the big technology company, no longer sells it in India. The Japanese have stopped investing in China. The Australians, who feel also threatened by China, are not allowing them to buy any raw material production, any iron ore mine or any gas land, and they are already talking about restricting supply. It will be all done economically. We ourselves are going to stop buying a lot of Chinese things under different headings. The aim here is containment, but not strategic containment, not ideological containment, economic containment. Because if China did not build a navy, they could grow at 9% and no longer get the population out of poverty. But since they build a navy, we have to get them to grow at 3.5% or 4%. Now, the latest growth figures for the United States now, this month, is 4%. In other words, we have high unemployment. We have unresolved public finance problem, huge problem of public finance. We need to increase taxes, reduce spending, but our economy has come out because that's how the American economy, first it falls, then it rises. So we're doing 4%, and if the Chinese want to build a navy, they have to grow with 4%. Since they're not stopping to build a navy, air force, and army, they will not be allowed to continue growing economically. And this will be done by measures of not buying, measures of not investing, measures of not selling. Now, Europe is not the protagonist of this, except the British, of course, because the British are already moving into their thing. If you notice, they decided to stop the aircraft carrier, the little one for the Mediterranean. They're going to build a big one to the Pacific, because they always have to be our partners and this stuff. And what happens? The Chinese can only come to one place to get an ally, which is Moscow. Beijing will tell, if you are the ruler, the Tsar of Russia, you can stay in your bed or in the bath there and get phone call from Beijing saying, please help us, because they want to have access and interchange with Russia, but also Central Asia, and to be able to communicate across Central Asia, to get to Iran and get to the Persian Gulf. So they'll have all they won't get natural gas from Australia, they'll get it from Iran, and Russia, of course, and some. And of course, Japan, if the Japanese want to continue quarreling about the Kurili Islands, they will be driving Russia into the Chinese side. Therefore, the Japanese will have to forget about the Kuril Islands. And this is a diplomatic revolution. Something you thought was very important is no longer important. Like the French and the British were quarreling over Fashoda, over little places in Sudan. Suddenly the order came from London, stop. We don't care who is in Fashoda. We don't care about the Eastern Sudan. We don't care about Western Sudan. We don't care about the whole of Africa. What we care about is the French alliance. So today, the Japanese politician cannot imagine that in 2 years' time, he will have to answer a newspaper guy who says, what about the Northern Territories? That's how they call it, the Northern Territories. It's about, I own a ranch personally in Bolivia. My ranch is much bigger than these Northern Territories, okay? Much bigger. And in 2 years' time, some journalist will ask a politician in New York, in Tokyo, what about the Northern Territories? That's how they call it, Northern Territories. And the politician will have to say, what Northern Territories? What? Because this already happened with Okinawa, of course. They were quarreling with us over the base in Okinawa. Suddenly they forgot it. In a diplomatic revolution, the Japanese will have to come to Moscow, and they will have to come trying to court Moscow. The Indians have, of course, very, very firmly maintained relations with Russia, never allowing diversification to be abandoning Russia, always maintaining. Vietnamese have always been your allies. People like the Australians have never been here. We ourselves will have to change our attitude. We can either worry about Estonia or Georgia, or we can worry about China. If we want Russia to be our friend with China, we cannot talk all the time about Georgia. Everybody in a diplomatic revolution has to change. Some people change fast, some people change slowly, but it's one of those inevitable things. And it will make Moscow the center of world politics. Moscow will be the center of world politics. And everything will be fine except for your traffic situation here, disastrous traffic situation, so that you will be causing world diplomatic crisis non-stop because the minister will not arrive in time at the Kremlin. He will not be able to do it, you know. So the solution, of course, is to bring here some Latinsky, Strelsky, what is it called? To shoot everybody who parks illegally, you shoot him. Otherwise, apart from that. So for the first time, Moscow will not be threatened and it will not be ignored. So again, it will be very easy to make foreign policy in Russia because the only decision will be to say, to which of these telephone calls you say, yes, we can do it, and to which one you say, no, we won't do it. And that'll be the end of it. So it'll be very nice. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, доктор Люттвак. Вы обрисовали перед нами интересный вызов. Действительно, впервые за долгое время Россия имеет шанс оказаться не субъектом глобального конфликта, а либо объектом, либо оказаться в стороне. Да? Я думаю, мы должны поговорить о том, как бы нам желательно оказаться в стороне от этого конфликта. Впрочем, может быть, будут другие позиции. Я хочу передать слово модератору нашей дискуссии, руководителю Центра исследований постиндустриального общества Владиславу Иноземцеву, и попросить его, чтобы мы предусмотрели возможность задать доктору Люттваку вопросы, а не только выступить после. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Михаил, я думаю, мы начнем с вопросов, наверное. У кого из коллег есть вопросы? Достаточно краткие. Да, конечно, давайте. Вы представляете, пожалуйста?
Да, Андрей Кобяков. У меня есть вопрос к доктору Люттваку, частный, потому что есть что прокомментировать. В данном случае просто хотелось бы уточнить позицию. Вы сказали, что темпы Китая могут оставаться высокими, если Китай не станет строить флот. Приводили в какой-то мере убедительные исторические примеры. Мне хотелось бы задать вопрос, какие бы были бы темпы экономического развития в Соединенных Штатах Америки, если бы они не строили флот?
You cannot absolutely compare the United States with China. Absolutely not.
Why?
The following reason. If you look at the relations between Washington and Ottawa in the last century, relations between Washington and Mexico City, the United States has never allowed or put power relationship into that. This is not China.
What about civil war?
Excuse me a second.
Yes.
Excuse me a second.
Sorry.
If the Chinese go to Singapore, okay, and say, like when we go to Canada, we ask the Canadians, can you please cooperate on this border thing, okay? There is economic issues, there are practical issues, but the Canadians don't feel American power on their head. The Canadians don't care if we have 1 aircraft carrier or 100 aircraft carriers, if we have 100 bombers and so on. So if the Chinese had remained in peaceful rise, as they wanted to, because they understood all this. Before they understood it, now they forgot it. But then the Chinese foreign minister goes to Singapore, right, and says, of course, it doesn't matter that we are a big country or a small country. The important thing is to agree, because we have to agree functionally. When you don't have a power relationship, the power is not relevant to it. And the United States has not got a power relationship with Mexico and with Canada. That's why Mexico and Canada have never been available allies for anti-American policy. If we had treated Mexico and Canada the way powerful countries treat other countries, then in the past history, the first thing you would do is to make a good alliance with Mexico, an alliance with Canada, to squeeze the Americans. But you cannot do that. And that is what the Chinese, the whole idea of peaceful rise, developed by clever people, intelligent people, was to have a non-power relationship with China. That when we talk to Japan, we have economic issues with this, but we don't threaten. We do not threaten. So nobody cares whether you build a navy or you don't build a navy. But they lost it. They became in a classic power politics sense, and therefore evoked a reaction. The problem in strategy is that when you are the little city-state of Siena and you become a little richer, then the neighboring city-states get concerned about you, and neutrals become enemies, and people who are your allies become neutral. And that's what's been happening here. And we have never done this. We have never created a world of enemies. We created a world of allies. We got all these allies. And we got these allies because of the way the American policy goes. We go and bomb and invade and attack countries like Iraq, okay? But we don't threaten the countries that we consider to be working with equally. So the Chinese could use force, let's say, to deal with let's say they had a problem in the Burma-Myanmar border, okay, something like that. But with India, they cannot use power and force and patrolling without causing this reaction. And that's the difference.
Professor Люттвак, it seems to me that you underestimate the complexity of German relations with neighbors when you spoke about conflict with Britain, about Navy. Possibly the most serious conflict was with Russia. And it seems to me that it would be a mistake to reduce the complexity of international relations before 1914 to the British-German competition in the creation of Navy. It seems to me that that's not a very good example. And it seems that Chinese, despite their possible mistaken attitude toward Japan and toward Vietnam, are very cautious about not to create enemies.
Actually, this is a very effective way of discussing this matter, because German quarrel with Russia would be about Poland, territory, important areas. But what they quarreled with sorry, the German quarrel with Russia would have been about important things. Poland, territorial control, European control. But the quarrel they had with the British was because they wanted to have colonies in Tanganyika and Togo. The quarrel with the French would have been important in Alsace-Lorraine, but they go and have a quarrel over Morocco. What is the value of Tanganyika? When you have Siemens and the University of Berlin and the Deutsche Bank, you want Tanganyika, and for this you quarrel with the British? See, if the German quarrel with Russia would have been understandable, but it was not. The Germans, if they wanted to have a nice war with Russia, they could. but they could not do it while also being enemies of the British Empire and the French Empire. They had to be friends with the British, friends with the French, give them Alsace and Lorraine, just give it on a plate, and then they could have a wonderful war with Russia. Maybe they win, maybe they lose. Maybe this time they get all the way to Vladivostok. But what now? Cautious. The Indian ambassador in Delhi, his name is Jai Shankar. He's the son of Krishna Swami Subramaniam, the great strategist of India who died a week ago, my very good friend. Sorry to lose him. Jai Shankar is as intelligent as his father. He has done an analysis, unofficially published in the papers in India, which does not describe Chinese policy as cautious or incautious, but with the English word reckless. I don't know how you say reckless. Example of reckless. First time after 50 years challenging Indian position on Kashmir, claiming to have the whole of the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, supplying a nuclear reactor to Pakistan. All in 1 year. If this is not maximum provocation. Now, the next thing that happened, as you know, 3 months ago, the Chinese Prime Minister, Wen Jiabao, went to Delhi with a delegation of 500 businessmen saying, we want to buy and import and so on. And when he went back to Beijing, they asked him how it was in Delhi. He says it was frozen. Because this is not like in the book of Shunze, that the king of Ping makes a war with the king of Wu, and then Wu and Ping against Chen, and then Chen becomes friend with Ping. Now, once you quarrel with a country like India, it takes 40 years before this quarrel over. And with the Japanese, it will take 20 years for the Japanese to recover from the Senkaku incident. This is not cautious. You don't go and raise territorial questions at the same time with countries like that. Nor do you negotiate with the Australians over the purchase of shares in Rio Tinto, and in the middle of the negotiation, they arrested 5 executives of Rio Tinto, Australians, and put them in prison. Okay? When you do that, the Australians close the door on you for the next 10 years. And right now, if a Russian company wants to buy an iron ore mine in Australia, or a British one, or whatever, they can buy it like that, no problem. Mr. Abramovich wants to buy iron ore mine, all he has to do is to send a wire transfer. I know somebody in Melbourne who owns a very big iron ore mine. He'd be happy to sell it to Mr. Abramovich, just 50% over the value. If the Chinese want to buy the smallest iron ore mine in Australia, never will be allowed to do it. Why is that? Because once you negotiate the way they did, it takes 20 years for people to forget it. This is not the king of Wu and the king of Ping. All of them in the Chinese culture world playing games. And that's what they did. And that's why Moscow will become the center of world diplomacy. Because China wants you, and anti-China will want you. And they'll pay the price.
Коллеги, я думаю, что было 2 замечательных вопроса, и, на мой взгляд, можно переходить к дискуссии. Я думаю, все сумеют высказаться, если не будем затягивать. На мой взгляд, доктор Люттвак поднял очень важный вопрос. На самом деле, на протяжении последних многих десятилетий Запад противостоял Востоку в холодной войне, но сегодня выясняется, что тот Восток, с которым боролся Запад, был, в общем-то, не вполне настоящим Востоком. Это было частью Запада, его воплощением, его эманацией. Сегодня поднимается настоящий Восток, и проблем в отношениях с ним у Запада не становится меньше. Я во многом поддерживаю точку зрения, которая высказана. Ее, на мой взгляд, доктор Люттвак не открыл. Появилось в последние годы много книг, в частности, работ, посвященных конфликтам в Азии, попытки Китая окружить Индию, так называемая «жемчужная цепочка». Это китайские базы от Бирмы до Сейшел, от Кении до Пакистана, разработка глубоководного порта в Гвадаре, попытки укрепиться с ограниченным контингентом в Судане и так далее и тому подобное прочее. То есть на самом деле такие попытки, которые глубоко противоречили идее мирного возвышения, они существовали давно. Но проблема, которую сегодня интересно было бы обсудить, она заключается, на мой взгляд, в том, что Китай сегодня не только ошибается, возможно, в своей стратегии, как говорит доктор Люттвак, но в то же время он является лидером того мира нового индустриализма, о котором профессор писал очень много, и противостоит Соединенным Штатам и другим государствам Запада в качестве новой индустриальной сверхдержавы, в то время как эти государства деиндустриализируются, о чем профессор тоже неоднократно писал. В этой ситуации где находимся мы? Да, безусловно, спрос на Россию в менее стабильном и более конфликтном мире вырастет. Но это будет спрос на Россию, которая деиндустриализована больше, чем США, которая в значительной мере ослаблена, которая слабее Китая сегодня военно, не говоря уже экономически. И это опять-таки наше возвращение потенциальное в мировую политику не станет возвращением равного игрока, а станет возвращением в этой картине как некого компонента, который может усилить позиции одного из главных игроков. На самом деле это, на мой взгляд, не лучший вариант возвращения. То есть фактически, да, нас будут спрашивать, с кем мы хотим быть, но мы не сможем спрашивать, кто хочет быть с нами, что мы привыкли делать, на самом деле, в советской и российской политике многих десятилетий. Поэтому вопрос сегодня заключается в том, в картине мира, где все приезжают или звонят в Москву и спрашивают, с кем вы хотите быть, есть ли у нас у самих понимание, с кем нам выгодно быть и с кем нам нужно создавать союзы. Фактически, когда профессор Люттвак абсолютно правильно говорит, что в условиях процветания, успеха приходит гордыня и непонимание реальностей, то не меньшая гордыня и непонимание реальностей может прийти в условиях, когда ты всем нужен. Это тоже элемент, подчеркивающий и поддерживающий гордыню и неадекватное восприятие реальности. Поэтому я буду очень признателен, если коллеги в своих выступлениях и комментариях остановятся в том числе, в первую очередь, на оценке позиции профессора Люттвака, насколько убедительно она кажется присутствующим, и по возможности прокомментирует ее с точки зрения того, что может сделать Россия, куда ей нужно идти, с кем выстраивать отношения и какие долгосрочные перспективы мы видим перед своей страной в политическом и геоэкономическом, пользуясь термином профессора Люттвака, смысле. Я прошу выступать и придерживаться регламента в районе 5 минут. Я буду прерывать или показывать, когда остается 1 минута. Спасибо. Представляйте, пожалуйста, после стенограммы.
Юрий Громыко. Мне кажется, что тот сценарный вызов, который обрисовал профессор Люттвак, он очень и стимулирующий, и убедительный до того, что даже почти возникает ощущение, что, возможно, это может быть новая официальная стратегия Соединенных Штатов формировать пояс сил сдерживания Китая, и вообще России можно было бы почить на лаврах и просто действительно стать такой столицей и только бороться, чтобы не было пробок, и попросить нового мэра Москвы этот процесс ускорить. Но, с другой стороны, нам понятны и ходы, которые осуществляются в рамках проекта, так называемого, который очень будоражит Европу, Химерика, то есть Чайна плюс Америка. Это тоже один из вызовов. Но, безусловно, значительно более важно то, что сказал Владислав Иноземцев, это тот тип неоиндустриализма, который развертывается в Китае, потому что, вот, оценивая выставку в Шанхае, можно сказать, что фактически Китай показал следующее, что все позитивные технологии, которые можно взять из Германии, Франции, Италии, Штатов, мы взяли, и теперь мы их выносим на широчайший рынок в Южную Америку, в Африку. И так, на мой взгляд, и были построены павильоны. И с этой точки зрения павильон России с Усяоджи, с Незнайкой, он не совсем там был понятен на фоне этой вот всей оркестрации. И, конечно, как говорят тоже специалисты по военной стратегии Индии, они очень простую вещь говорят, очень близкую к тому, что сказал профессор Люттвак, что когда некоторая страна сверхусиливается без коммуникации с другими, имея в виду Китай, обязательно последует ответ силовой. В этой связи мне представляется одна из наиболее интересных перспектив разговора с Китаем, мы про это даже немножко писали, это трансевразийский коридор развития сверхскоростные поезда, и у Китая есть интерес к этому делу. Причем, на мой взгляд, про это тоже есть обсуждение в прессе, что, скажем, транскоридор через Казахстан, он будет приводить к тому, что будет отмирать Транссиб. На наш взгляд, по подсчетам это не совсем так. И вот вытаскивание Китая в эту зону, которая требует действительно серьезных и интересных инфраструктурных проектов, где в том числе заново встанет вопрос о российской науке, которая пока не участвует, на наш взгляд, по-настоящему в модернизации, а Китай на пороге. В принципе, какую мы область не возьмем, там, например, такую, скажем, экзотическую, как детонационные наноалмазы, вот-вот уже появятся эти технологии. Вот здесь, мне кажется, очень интересный, стимулирующий момент отношения к тем сценариям, которые мне представляются очень убедительными. Спасибо большое.
Maybe not. Maybe it's better to round up. Yeah.
Мне кажется, что профессор Люттвак обрисовал здесь, так сказать, чисто силовое видение мира. В условиях прошлых времен это силовое видение действительно, в общем, доминировало, по-видимому. И трудно было ожидать хотя, между прочим, был период европейского концерта, когда тоже отношения были совершенно другие. Но, тем не менее, доминировала силовая компонента. Сейчас, насколько я понимаю, сам профессор Люттвак подчеркивает, что экономическая компонента доминирует. Значит, мы должны, может быть, меньше обращать внимание на политику, так сказать, связанную с какими-то такими силовыми импульсами, чем на реальные экономические интересы. И если говорить о реальных экономических интересах, то, на мой взгляд, вырисовывается очень интересная перспектива, скажем, среди стран БРИК. То есть объединение 4 развивающихся рынков, в общем, направленное против, ну, не направленное против, но, во всяком случае, конкурирующее с, так сказать, западным миром. И мне кажется, что вот профессор Люттвак недооценивает все-таки силу экономических интересов, потому что экономические интересы явно тянут в эту сторону. И если мы посмотрим, что делается с БРИК сейчас, то, в общем, в известном смысле это бум. Вот мы проделали работу на эту тему, и видно, что этот концепт, запущенный аналитиками Goldman Sachs где-то там 10 лет назад, сейчас превращается реально в экономический блок. Поэтому мне кажется, что тут нужно как-то балансировать вот это чисто силовое видение международных отношений и, так сказать, геоэкономическое.